My name is Ben Marlin. I'm a faculty member in computer science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I'm the Associate Director for the Massachusetts AI and Technology Center for Connected Care in Aging and Alzheimer's Disease, or Mass AITC for short, the host of this webinar. For those who are joining for the first time, Mass AITC is an NIA-funded pilot project granting center focused on technologies for supporting aging and ADRD care in the at-home setting. If you're interested in applying for pilot project funding, the next application deadline is coming up on July 31st, and more information is available on the center website. You can check the chat for some links. This is the second in a series of talks that will focus on foundational topics related to technology development, human factors, and study design and deployment. The first talk in the series was given by Dr. Ed Ramos, co-founder of the Digital Trials Center at Scripps Research and Chief Scientific Officer at Care Evolution. That talk covered digital and remote study design methodology. And for those who missed it, that talk is available from the Mass AITC website. The third talk in the series is coming up on August 29th, so save the date for that. It will be given by Professor Omer Innen from Georgia Tech, and will focus on development of integrated sensing and machine learning approaches for health monitoring applications. Registration is open for that webinar as well. Today's webinar will be given by Professor Pedja Klasnja. Pedja is a faculty member in the School of Information at the University of Michigan. His research is at the intersection of human-computer interaction and health behavior change. He's particularly interested in the design and evaluation of just-in-time adaptive interventions that continuously adapt their functioning to provide optimal support to individuals as their needs and circumstances change over time. Pedja's presentation today will focus on developing useful and usable health technologies for older adults through user-centered design. I will turn it over to Pedja. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. So when Ben asked me to do this talk, he was saying that I should really focus on sort of unique aspects of user-centered design and how that can be applied to the design of technologies for older adults. So I'm going to give you a sort of a flavor of some of the methods that we use in user-centered design that I think are particularly well suited for dealing with this particular design problem. So to get us started, let me just see if I can move my slides. Typically, when we think about sort of the development of technology, we have in mind something like this kind of a linear life cycle, where we start with sort of conceptualizing the problem, trying to figure out what are the problems that our intervention is trying to solve, what are the key constraints, and then we sort of move through in stages by sort of initially designing some kind of a system that will address those problems, optimizing that system, typically using something like either factorial experiments or micro-randomized trials to really nail down what features this technology needs to have from the available options, how those features should work, and so on. And then moving on to things like efficacy and effectiveness evaluations. And then if everything goes well and we have something that is really effective, moving into implementation and scale up. But anyone who has actually done this process knows that things work a little bit differently in reality, and that typically when we actually do this style of work, it more looks like this, right? And this particular drawing is called the Design Scribble. It's developed by Damien Newman, who is now at Google. But it really sort of demonstrates that often the process is far less linear, and it's a lot more convoluted before we actually settle on a particular kind of solution that we want to move in. And the question is why? And what I want to suggest is that one way to sort of think about why the development of technologies, health technologies in general, and health technologies for older adults has this form, is that we should think about these kinds of systems and the development of these kinds of systems as a wicked problem. And this is a term that comes out of Rittel and Weber's classic 1973 paper on the sort of general problems in the theory of planning, where they really define a certain set of problems that, in their case, urban planners were dealing with, but I think they apply just as well to this domain, as having very specific features that make really knowing whether you have created a good solution to these problems difficult to tell. And there are a number of features that Rittel and Weber identify. Among them is this key thing that there's really no definitive formulation of the problem. So in other words, what happens is that what problem you're trying to solve is actually getting negotiated with whatever group it is that you're trying to support, right? So what aspects of that problem are foregrounded versus backgrounded, which ones are considered more versus less important. All of this is actually not clear up front, but has to be elicited and often negotiated and contested before something, the design problem itself is actually formalized. There are also no clear stopping rules. It's never clear sort of how big the problem is or should be, and where do you stop when it comes to creating a solution, right? So that a lot of these questions around how the scoping is done, again, have to be done on the fly and are negotiated as the process is going on, and it's not something that can be determined upfront. There are also no definitive tests of a solution, right? So it's really hard to tell whether things worked exactly as intended, partly because often consequences take some time to develop, right? So in the case of the work that I do, which is health behavior change, what we see over and over again is that it's relatively straightforward to get people to make their changes in behaviors short term. So if you want them to become more physically active, it's pretty easy to get people to do that for a month or two. But a year later or 2 years later, the behavior often comes back to where it was before, right? And so knowing sort of what constitutes success, right? I mean, is it at 1 month? Is it at 2 months? Is it at a year? Is it 5 years down the road? Again, none of that is actually clear upfront. The other thing is that anything that we do in this space sort of changes the situation in which we're working in. So there's really no such thing as doing trial and error within a single context, right? So anything that you deploy ends up changing that context and the people that you're working with. And so if something doesn't work out, the next solution that you try is now being tried with people who are changed, right? Who have already experienced the first solution, who might be less optimistic about the next thing working, who might be less engaged in the process, and so on. So we can think about sort of trial and error happening at a broader scale across different contexts, across different studies, but in any given setting, we basically have one time to try something, right? And then there's no clear set of sort of predefined solutions from which you choose pick and choose, right? So we often are, even when we're working on the exact same problem, so in that case, let's say physical activity, although there are some techniques that are commonly used in this domain, how those are operationalized for a particular context and for a particular population is going to be largely dependent on the particular contextual factors that are taking place in that context. And so they will have to be changed. And which leads to this sort of key part is that every problem is actually unique because the context and the circumstances with which you're working are going to be unique from setting to setting. And so when you take these things together, what basically this means is that it's really difficult to develop a really science of intervention in the sense where you can sort of know exactly the things that are going to work and just put them together and know in advance that they're going to work as well as you expect them, right? And instead, we basically have to take every particular situation and develop something that is at least partially new or partially adapted to that context in order to make progress. Now, one way for dealing with wicked problems is through design. And so you can sort of think about design as really being a systematic process that allows us to take these kinds of ill-defined problems and make progress with them. Ultimately, what design allows you to do is, as Kerber-Simon says here, is that it actually allows you to create good solutions that optimize achievement of some set of objectives, given what is known around the constraints and the circumstances in which that solution is supposed to work. The problem, of course, is that often neither, as we were just discussing, neither the objectives nor the constraints are clear up front. And what makes design process interesting is that it gives you a systematic way of formulating those objectives and constraints at the same time as the solution is being generated. So the sort of the key part of that I think makes thinking in terms of these kinds of problems, like development of technologies for older adults in design terms, what makes that valuable is that it allows you to sort of get a handle on the wickedness of these problems and really try to unpack exactly what the problem it is that you're trying to solve, as well as the constraints at the same time as you're trying to generate a solution. So how is that done? The key part of the design process is that there are multiple things that are constantly iterating, you're iterating among steps, right? You're trying to understand the problem, and there are a bunch of different techniques for doing that. You can do interviews, you can do focus groups, you can do literature search, you can do community-based participatory research, and so on. There are ways of trying to generate solution alternatives. And so this is typically in design called ideation, and really refers to this notion that you're trying to initially create as many solutions as possible. And there are techniques that are used for that. So brainstorming is one of them. Sketching is often used, especially in technology design, to sort of come up with a bunch of ideas for how a particular feature can work, as well as the things that like scenarios and personas, which we'll be talking a little bit more about in depth in this talk. And then there are various ways of sort of refining those solutions, including creating low fidelity prototypes and wireframes, as well as things like formative evaluations and heuristic evaluations and so on, as well as sort of ways of selecting a good solution from the available set. So this is sort of the key part, is that you're constantly bouncing among these various stages where you're trying to understand your problem. Based on that understanding, you come up with some ideas for a potential solution. Those ideas go back to the people, to the population you're working with for initial feedback. That might help you understand the problem better, right? And then based on what is emerging in terms of constraints, what is emerging in terms of preferences and so on, you're constantly renegotiating the scope of the problem, as well as the sort of which aspects of the solution need to be prioritized and developed further. And so that iterative nature of this process, bouncing across these 4 different areas allows you to do this dance of both formulating what problem you're trying to solve, as well as part of that process, creating solutions that try to match to that problem as well as possible. So what I want to do for the next few minutes is give you a sense of 2 particular techniques that are, to my knowledge, relatively unique to user-centered design as it is applied to technology research, that I think are particularly valuable for dealing for creation of health technologies, including health technologies for older adults. And in particular, I'm talking here about personas and scenarios. So personas is a technique that was originally developed by Alan Cooper, and that is intended to help you do a translation from the formative research. So from doing interviews with your potential participants, from doing literature review, competitive analysis, and things like that, and a clear sense of what is the target audience that you're developing your solution for. And so you can think of both personas and scenarios as what I typically refer to as translational representations. They're basically specific, concrete representations of your understanding, of your current understanding of the problem, that allow you to slowly move from this mass of Post-it notes and memos and so on that is generated as part of user research to increasingly more specific features of a technology that you're trying to build. And in the case of the personas, what personas allow you to do is to define key types of the intended users for whom you're designing. And they're fictional characters in the sense that they're actually not individual people with whom you talked, but they're based on the data that you're collecting as part of your formative research to really identify the key classes of users who you're trying to support. There are a few particular key characteristics of personas. One is that again, they're actually based in data. So in your literature review, in your interviews, and so on. And so even though the characters themselves are fictional, they're supposed to embody the best data that you have about the problem that you're trying to solve. And that data is then formed around individual people who have goals, they have traits, and particular behaviors and contexts that might influence how they would use the technologies that you're trying to design, as well as for what purposes, right? For what goals those technologies would be used, right? And the key part here is that you're trying to represent distinct classes of users, which will allow you to figure out, like, is there a single solution that can work for all of these, or you might need to actually create custom solutions for different types of users. So let's see what that might look like. So here's one persona, for example. This person is John, right? And what you see here is that there's sort of several buckets of information that are often articulated for a particular persona. In this particular case, we know John's age, that he was formerly a librarian, that he's currently retired, and he's living with his wife. But the key part that you probably want to pay attention to are these sort of motivators that are related to the behavior that you're trying to encourage, as well as the constraints that might come into play when you're developing your solution. So both this persona and the next persona, I'm sort of envisioning in the context of creating a physical activity intervention for older adults, right? And so for John, being independent and not being burden for his children is a big motivation for why he's trying to be active. And he's wanting to be able to actually have quality time with his grandchildren. So he's wanting to stay mobile enough and functional enough to actually be able to do that. Now, in terms of his constraints, one of the key constraints that would have to be taken into account is that John is a chronic heart failure patient, right? And that has a couple of different implications. One is that his symptoms and sort of how much energy he has is going to vary a great deal from day to day, right? The other one is that safety ends up being sort of a key concern. So whenever an intervention is being developed, sort of making sure that whatever recommendations are being made, the goals are being suggested and so on, are going to be done in a way that allow John to both feel safe, as well as if there is an issue of some sort involved, a healthcare team becomes a priority. And then there could be different kinds of constraints that really have to do with sort of the environment in which the system might be used, right? So in this particular case, we know that John lives in Michigan, where it gets really cold for about 6 months a year, so it might make exercising outside difficult. We have some information about the financial constraints, right? So going to gym that has paid classes might not be an option in this particular case, as well as that he prefers sort of having routines and structures, right? So how you think about interventions might vary based on that. Another person might be someone like Mary, who is a little bit younger. She's still working, has a lot more financial resources that are available, but also is much more motivated by novelty and social contact, right? So Mary gets bored really easily. She's a very social person, so she enjoys spending time with other people, right? But her constraints have to do with living in a suburban environment where there's not necessarily many places to walk, as well as that her work days are really long, and she often works on weekends, right? Which might sort of change what kind of things might be possible, right? And in this particular case, we have someone who is actually financially secure and has a fair bit of disposable income, right? And high technical literacy. And just thinking about these two people, it might become pretty obvious that that's unlikely for a single solution to work across both of these, unless that solution can be tailored in some meaningful way for these two classes of users. And so one of the advantages of using personas is that it makes those kinds of things pretty clear, right? It makes them very clear, salient for the designers. So personas typically have multiple elements, right? Often you include some form of demographic information that might influence use of technology. And so things like technological literacy might be a key one, right? Often goals and motivators are a key part of personas, because you're really trying to situate any kind of a solution in relation to the things that are driving the individuals that you're trying to support, as well as sort of having some information about behavior and context, right? What kind of routines that people are engaged in, how much available free time they have, the context in which they live and work, and so on. What makes personas particularly beneficial is that they allow you to summarize a great deal of data pretty efficiently, right? And not only do they summarize that, but they give you sort of, you can think of it as mental shortcuts for thinking about this information, right? So when you're thinking about a particular feature that you might want to design, you can ask questions like, would Mary do this, all right? Or how would John react to this? And so having these people that are living in your head allow you to really have very quick checks on design decisions that are being made. The other thing that makes this really valuable is that it provides concrete external representations that allows both the design team, and in the case of doing co-design with target users, to really to have a discussion about who the intended users are. So the users don't end up getting out what is in user-centered design typically referred to as the elastic user, where basically over time, or as the design process progresses, more and more sort of characteristics get added to the user, and you end up with basically the solution being designed for people who don't exist, right? And finally, what makes the personas really powerful as part of the design process is that they're really good representations for involving non-designers, right? So whether that's programmers, whether it's community partners, you can basically have something that can be thrown onto the whiteboard, and you can say, okay, so we think this is what we've learned about who we're designing this for, and that can be negotiated and revised. So what, again, makes personas particularly valuable is that it allows you data about the users in a very concrete form that can then be used to make decisions about what kind of solutions might be good for supporting those users. Now, once you have that, another technique that can be really helpful is a technique called scenarios. And this comes from a body of work called scenario-based design that was developed by Jack Carroll going back to late 1970s and early 80s, and has been sort of a prominent line of work in user-centered design ever since. And what scenarios try to do is provide a different kind of translational representation, where now you're moving not just from the formative research to individual people that you're trying to support, but now you're actually you're finally moving to features of a technology. And this is one of what I think is one of the unique features of user-centered design as a subfield of design, is that scenarios allow a very concrete way of making that translation from knowing what trying to understand what the problem is and what the constraints are to actual features of the solution that is being designed. So how do scenarios do this? Well, what scenarios are is that they're short stories about specific users who are using the technology to accomplish particular goals in specific context. And the key terms here are that there's stories, right? And you will see one in just a minute. That stories are about specific people who are doing specific things, right? They're either trying to achieve a goal and sort of hitting barriers, or they're actually using the envisioned technology to overcome those barriers to actually accomplish the goals that they're trying to do. And that's all happening within the context in which these individuals live and work, right? And so what that allows you to do is to actually bridge your understanding of the user needs and actual ideas about how a particular health technology may be able to support those needs. So let's see what that looks like. So here's one scenario, and I will sort of read it, but you can see it on the screen as well. Mary is a cardiac attack patient in this case, and says ever since Mary returned to work after her heart attack, she has struggled to incorporate regular physical activity into daily life. And so she's hoping that this application, HealthyHeart, would be able to help with that. As Mary is finishing her meeting, her activity tracker gently vibrates to indicate that HealthyHeart has sent her an activity suggestion. When Mary looks at her phone, she finds a message showing her a three shaded walking route to her next meeting that would give her about 1,500 steps. She gets thumbs up to indicate she liked the suggestion, and she follows the suggested route. That evening after dinner, HealthyHeart alerts her that there is a Latin dance with a live band 3 days later at the restaurant 20 minutes away. Oh, great, Mary thinks. This could be a fun way to get more intense activity to meet my weekly activity goal. And she taps, let's do it. And then the dance and the directions are added to her calendar. So what does this thing do? Well, the one thing that you should note about this particular paragraph, and this is just, I don't know, 100 words maybe in length, right? So very short, right? Is that it explicitly ties intervention ideas to the key needs and constraints in Mary's life. So you saw the persona of Mary in this particular case. You know, the two pieces of information that this scenario covers is that she's sort of bouncing from meeting to meeting during her long work days, and so it's basically trying to incorporate some activity into her work day, right? In this particular case, by helping her go to the next meeting in a slightly more roundabout way. The other one is this notion that Mary has a high need for novelty, right? And so that the way the scenario deals with that is that it provides an idea for something sort of new that Mary might be able to do that would also give her some activity, right? The other thing what the scenario does is that it articulates key characteristics that this particular solution might have, right? In this particular case, the two things that we see is that the app is proactive. So it's sending Mary notifications with suggestions for what you might be able to do. And that it's trying to be sort of just in time and contextually tailored. So it's trying to basically provide those suggestions at a time when Mary can act on them, right? And finally, the scenario is also articulating the goals that this technology is trying to accomplish. One is that Mary is both trying to get some sort of activity throughout her day. So there's this notion of a daily, probably step goal that is being supported, as well as a weekly activity goal that is more in terms of more intense physical activity, right? And finally, the other part of it is that it also, what we see here is also that the scenario is actually describing a particular kind of emotional reaction that Mary has to the technology. In this particular case, what the technology is trying to encourage is this notion of sort of delight, right? Pleasant surprise, and in order to support engagement, right? And so, as this an example, you can sort of see why scenarios would be useful, right? The explicitly connect features that are being considered to user needs and constraints. They can be very easily revised, so they're sort of cheap to create and cheap to discard, right? So you can sort of create one, get feedback on it, and then very easily revise it, right? And just like personas, they're also really good representations that can be shared with a broad range of stakeholders, right? So you can create a set of scenarios that can be shown to target users, that can be shown to other stakeholders. Maybe there's a healthcare system that is involved in this particular case, and there are some stakeholders within that would need to see these. And so it allows for this really very fluid way of both eliciting early feedback and engaging in co-design. And finally, they sort of support reflection as explicitly as part of the design process. So in the case of HealthyHeart, right, there are some things that immediately pop up, right, given the scenario. So one question becomes pretty clear is like, if you have a system that is very much sort of push notification based, like how many suggestions could Mary tolerate before she gets annoyed, right? How do they need to be spaced out? What would the system need to know to actually be able to provide good suggestions, right? There's a whole bunch of information that a system like this would need to understand, and in order to be able to create the kind of suggestions that were envisioned in this scenario. Like, is that feasible? Like, where would we get that information? What kind of sensing and data mining is needed to actually get at that information? Is that something that can be incorporated into the system? Questions around user interactions. So what should the system do with the Mary if it suggests something to Mary and Mary says this is a terrible idea, right? You need to be able to somehow handle that. Where would the ideas for these novel activities come from, and so on? Like, there's a whole bunch of things that come just from considering this little paragraph of text that would need to be fleshed out, that would allow you to make some decisions about, is this particular direction that you're considering feasible? Is it something where things might break, and to move the design process forward? So every scenario has a number of elements that are typically shared. One is the setting, right? So in this particular case, it's a situation in which activity occurs. In our case, there's both sort of physical setting, and for the first part of the scenario, that was while Mary is at work. For the second part of the scenario, it's one after dinner when she's at home, as well as potentially sort of setting in terms of where in the relation to the technology something is happening. So in both of these cases, what we have is a push notification that is being sent, right? There are agents that are involved. In this particular case, the only agent is Mary, but you can have scenarios where there are multiple stakeholders that are involved in the scenario that's being described. The goals that the individual is trying to pursue, actions that individual takes, and then any kind of events that actually happen as a result of those actions, right? What's important to note is that you can actually pack all of this into relatively short pieces of text, right? So in the scenario that I showed you a couple of minutes ago is relatively representative of the length of the scenarios that people typically develop. There are also different kinds of scenarios that can be used for different purposes. One is what that's typically called problem scenarios, which is really a summary of the information that you elicited during your formative work, right? So it's really trying to make more concrete and more illustrative that how people currently dealing with their the goals and the things that they're trying to do. So if I were to design a problem scenario for Mary, right, I might talk about the things that she has tried before she gets to she discovers this new application, right? The goals really have to do with what Mary is trying to do and why, right? So in some ways that can flesh out some of the issues that already showed up in personas. There are things called activity scenarios, which really are transforming the current practice into new design features. So this is really the sort of where the scenarios like the one that we just saw come into play, as well as sort of task scenarios at various levels of granularity that talk about how a particular person is using the technology or is currently trying to accomplish the task, right? So that can be either in the sort of current practice, sort of how Mary is currently doing it. So this is a problem task scenario, as well as envision future. So if we sort of fleshed out the scenario that you just saw a little bit in terms of sort of what are the steps that Mary actually is taking beyond just hitting a single button, that would be more of a task scenario. And finally, there's sort of interaction scenarios, which is really the sort of physical actions that the person takes and the way that the system is responding to those physical actions, right? So this is much sort of you can think of it as a sort of most granular version of a task scenario that really has to do with going the person's interaction with the system itself. So to wrap things up on the scenarios, some things to sort of keep in mind. One is that you really don't need to be a great writer to write useful scenarios. These are not supposed to be pieces of literature. They're just supposed to make your current ideas about both what is currently happening in your, that you discover in your formative work, as well as sort of how you think these initial ideas would be transforming that situation, make that concrete, right? The other thing, like with personas, the idea is that scenarios should be quick, right? You should be able to sit down for 10, 15 minutes and just write one out. And so that means that you should be able to write quite a few of them, right? And that these rough scenarios that they describe different features of the situation, both the current situation and the envisioned situation, are often a lot more valuable than having a smaller number of scenarios that are really polished, right? So this is not this comes down to the fact that scenarios are really process artifacts, right? This is not the thing that you're actually aiming for. They're just representations that you're developing as part of the process of design to move the design process forward, right? And so they don't need to be perfect. They just need to be done well enough so that you can sort of articulate your ideas and you can get feedback from them, from the rest of the design team, as well as from your target users and other stakeholders. And finally, and I think this is actually pretty interesting, there's a fair bit of work that has been done recently in terms of using scenarios to try to envision what are the sort of unwanted side effects that the technology might have, right? And so Lisa Nathan and Pedja Friedman have done a fair bit of work in this space, and they have called it value scenarios, which really are trying to sort of say, okay, so here are all the, they take the same form, but they're really representing sort of futures where the use of the technology has gone to a place where you don't want it to go. And the idea for that is that you're trying to basically create those scenarios up front so you can put things in place as part of the design process to prevent those side effects of happening. So both of these, again, I think are really useful techniques that can be used across the design of various kinds of health technologies, and I think are very, very useful when developing for older adults as well. In the last couple of minutes, I just want to sort of make things a little bit more concrete in relation to other kinds of design considerations that come into play when designing for this particular population. And in particular, I want to sort of move a little bit beyond the kind of things that are known in current literature, where a lot of the work really focuses on sort of the physical limitations that older adults have, or the cognitive barriers, forgetfulness, things of that sort, and talk about a couple of things that have emerged from some of the work that I was part of that might also help you think about a broader range of things that need to be considered. So one of them, and I've seen this come up several times, is that there are some interesting trade-offs between the need for safety and the need for privacy. And so years ago, when I was at Intel Research, Philippos, who is one of the researchers at Intel at the time, he's now at Microsoft, did a fair bit of work on using sensing to try to basically detect activities of daily living in order to create support tools for helping older adults live independently longer. And one of the things that we saw over and over again is that there was a lot of pushback about certain kinds of sensing. So in particular, so even though it made a lot of sense to instrument the bed, for example, in order to know when the older adult is getting up and starting their day as a sort of check on their well-being, a surprisingly large number of older adults really rejected having their beds instrumented, and you can leave it up to you to imagine why, but it was very much a no-no for a lot of people. Similar kind of situation happened with instrumenting the bathrooms, right? Even though sort of sleeping in the shower was and falling in the bathroom is sort of a key concern, they really did not want this private space instrumented and that data being used to contact anyone else. And so there were these constant tensions between what kind of things can be sensed in order to increase the safety of the older adults versus what was considered sort of too much of a privacy intrusion, and that would not be acceptable in the context of sensing in a private home. Another thing that we see repeatedly is that there's this notion of sort of readiness for a system that has to really be present across all parties that are involved. So if you have a system that will notify an emergency department or a healthcare organization when an older adult has fallen or has a health crisis or whatever it is, the things need to be placed in place within that health organization clearly for those signals to be processed and responded to properly, as well as policy issues have to be in place in order to make sure that this work is being compensated, that the liability is clearly articulated, and so on. But so that is relatively clear. What we also saw is that with a number of systems where family members were involved with sort of getting signals about the safety and well-being of the older adults, there needs to be readiness on the family as well. That basically there need to be clearly identified individuals who will be receiving this information. That there needed to be clearly articulated procedures of how the information is going to be responded to. If one person is unable to respond to it, how that is going to be communicated to another person who would need to respond to. And so the readiness needed to be across a larger social network that the older adult has in order for the system to work. This also leads to this question of sort of what other things often end up getting implicated. And one of the issues that comes up often is that there is a lot of sort of friction that can be introduced into social relationships through different kinds of support systems that are intended to help older adults live more independently. So one of them has to do with just sort of self-presentation. So what we saw across multiple projects is that individuals might not be willing to share all of the information about their their current status, because it was really important for them not to worry other people, as well as to appear functional and healthy, right? So that there was a lot of need for actually providing older adults with a way of deciding what gets shared with whom, and overriding sort of overall general policies on sharing to make sure that sort of self-presentation and dignity can be maintained. Another piece that came up in multiple places is this notion that, especially when you have family members who are responding to signals, typically adult kids of older adults, managing that can get tricky, right? Where multiple, often the burden ends up falling on one of the children to do more of the responding to these technological systems than other children, which can create a lot of resentment. And then sort of there needed to be ways of sort of designing not just for safety of the older adults, but for the well-being of the whole broader family unit that is going to be using the system. And finally, again, sort of that, and you're likely aware of this, that the need for sort of social contact is really high in this population. So often the interventions that have a strong social component, whether it's in the real world or mediated to the technology, can end up working better. And finally, just want to conclude with this really interesting finding that we get across a number of studies, and a lot of my own work was in the context of physical activity and heart disease. And one of the things that we often see is that, at least with the mobile health technologies, older adults end up being more engaged than younger adults. And partly that might have to do with sort of having more of available free time. It might have something to do with just sort of feeling more strongly involved in the research process itself. But often when we think about engagement, one of the things that with respect to mobile health that we often worry about is sort of burden on participants and burden on users. And we try to sort of minimize how much the system actually demands of a user in order to maintain engagement, so they don't sort of get really burdened and disengaged. With older adults, we often find that more is actually more. That creating more interaction increases engagement rather than increases it. And this is sort of one population where I have seen that is very, very different than pretty much all the other populations I have ever worked with, where the level of interaction that is possible with these support systems seems to be substantially higher than what we see in other contexts. So I'm going to stop there. So I want to leave some time for questions, and thank you so much for your attention. And I'll stop sharing so I can see you and answer questions.
All right, thank you, Pedja. That was great. So there are a couple of questions in the chat. If people also want to put their hands up, if you've got things you'd like to ask Pedja, you can go ahead and do that. Let us start with Jose Ramos. If you're still on, do you want to go ahead with your question from the chat?
Oh,
Yep, go ahead.
yeah, I was asking, in the course of age of 65 to 100,
Yeah.
how many personas would you imagine creating? And I know that can be an answer that is just an opinion, but I mean, you could do it every year. So just have you been able to break it down?
So it really depends. So you can sort of think of personas as if you were running a clustering algorithm on your data, right? I mean, they're really, there's no predefined number of personas. It really comes down to what are the subtypes that you're seeing in the data. And so if it turns out that you're, and this is part of the reason why at the beginning I was saying that there's often this bouncing back and forth between the design and understanding your problem. If it turns out that you have 30 personas in your data, it might not be feasible to actually develop a single solution for those 30 people, different kinds of users. And you might actually, as a response to that, you might want to scope your problem more narrowly, so that you're actually only addressing sort of some subgroup of personas for which you can create a sort of a coherent solution. So a lot of this ends up being a process that really moves back and forth between understanding what who your population is, understanding what problem it is that you're trying to solve. So this notion of conceptualizing the problem is a key part of that the design process helps you do. So the idea is that often as part of the design process, you're actually changing your understanding what is the problem that you're trying to solve. You might start with a relatively sort of clear sense of what needs to happen, and then you start doing your formative work, and it turns out that that's actually not the key problem, or that you can only focus on one subset of that problem. And so things like personas can help you actually scope as well, but by just trying to understand sort of what is a meaningful subgroup of people for whom you can design. And just to your point about age, so sort of some larger age ranges might be one of the sort of defining characteristics of these personas. But you could have potentially, for let's say 65 to 70, or 75, where you actually have multiple personas, some of which are still working and highly active, others that are retired and have a very different set of circumstances. And again, it might be even for that single age range that you would be developing very different solutions for those different user groups.
Thank you.
All right, we've got a question from Wayne in the chat as well. Wayne?
Yeah, hi, thanks. Great talk. I'm a security and privacy guy. And I also have just been going through this with my own parents. And I think there are a lot of potential threat models. That's terminology, right? We use, it could be my sibling. It could be, somebody trying to take my parents' money, or it could also be just paranoia on the part of my own parents. And I wonder how you manage dealing with security, both real and perceived in your work.
Yeah, this is a really good question, and I wish I had a good answer to it. I mean, I'm a researcher, and a lot of what we do tend to be sort of proof of concept systems, where you have to deal with those issues to some extent, things like encryption and so on, but not at the level where you would need to deal with them if you're going to be Kaiser Permanente or something like that and implementing a system at a larger scale. And so I think in terms of the design process, part of my answer would be you actually incorporate those kinds of concerns into some of these representations, like scenarios, in the same way you would deal with other constraints, and you try to design around them, right? But I don't know that I have a good answer for it. It's like here are 5 things that you absolutely have to put into each one of these technologies to deal with those set of concerns. I would say just making the threat models explicit as both the sort of goals that the technology is supposed to be able to meet, as well as constraints around which you'll be designing, and then writing scenarios around them, designing features around them, getting feedback across the stakeholders is probably the way I would try to deal with that issue.
All right, thank you.
All right, Nitish?
Pedja, thank you for that. That was excellent. A nice overview and really helpful examples. I was hoping to push you a little bit to give us some guidance or experiences or reactions to co-designing for more than one person. And in the context of cognitive impairment, care partners, caregivers, a variety of different ways of sort of phrasing these constructs, it's usually more than one person, especially as cognitive impairment advances, and it may well be for a team of people, some of whom are formal, some of whom are informal, some are in larger networks, and some of whom are in smaller ones. And I think you were beginning to get this with your reflections at the end, that just being mindful of that process, or what happens afterwards. But even before that idea, there's still like, I'm the team. So could you just talk through us, do these constructs still apply to those groups? How would you approach them differently?
Yeah, absolutely. No, and thank you for that question. That's really good. So increasingly, I'm seeing for these types of technologies to be effective, the need for the co-design to happen from the very beginning, right? So we're at the in user-centered design, which we refer to that as participatory design. There are a number of different terminologies that they use in different areas, but the idea here is that really the members of the user group as a whole, right? So in this particular case, in what you were describing, it would be the older adults, it would be their family members, it would be members of the healthcare systems that would be responding to the information. Need to be brought together as part of the design process to both articulate their own priorities and constraints, as well as to sort of negotiate the overall objectives. So a lot of, and one of the things that the design process allows you to do is to really make the objectives and constraints contested, right? So where different parties can push on them and try to actually, and you can sort of think of this as really, I mean, the whole model ends up looking awfully like mediation, right? Where you're really trying to get people who are coming from, who have different priorities, who have different optimization functions and so on, and value functions, and trying to bring them to something that feels like everyone is getting something and they're not losing too much, right? And sometimes that's sort of the figuring out what is the vision that everyone can say, yeah, I can live with that, is best you can do, right? And so some of these design representations allow you to actually make that explicit, right? So it's a process of bringing people to the table, eliciting first the information, converting them into these shared representations that you can then you can bring back, and scenarios are particularly good for that. And saying it's like, okay, if we were to go in this direction, right? What, could you live with that, and what issues are you seeing with that? And then different parties were going to push on that and require different kinds of changes. I partly sort of that mediation process should eventually lead, and it's messy. Like that's one of the reasons why that sort of design squiggle exists. Like there's a lot of that is content, both trying to accommodate different perspectives as well as come to some sense of a common shared core of priorities that the solution is going to be addressing. And so I don't know that there is a clean way of doing that, other than actually bringing these people to the table and having them work iteratively through sort of multiple rounds of process to get to something that everyone can live with. The good news is that if that can be done, you have a lot to buy in from the beginning. So once the system is actually designed, a lot of the things that we in medicine often think of as sort of implementation barriers have already been addressed, right? Because they have been addressed as part of the design process. If you design something without one of these parties in place and just try to plop it into a setting, now all of a sudden there's all of this additional support that needs to be put in place to create buy-in for the system to work effectively. So that question is like, at what point do you want to deal with sort of barriers, right? You want to, and these conflicting priorities. You can do it up front as part of the design process, or you can do it as part of the implementation. It still has to be done. And my preference is for trying to sort of front load that to as much as possible to the design process, because I think we end up with both better results and sort of smoother implementation. Does that get at your question?
Yeah, no, I think it absolutely does. And I fully endorse this idea, right? Like it's not a single system. The scenario or the persona doesn't need to be one person. It could be multiple people. And so the approach that you advocate, it provides enough flexibility, and it's sort of consistent with good user-centered design. What gives me a touch of pause, although what you're saying is completely correct, is that I don't think the distinction between doing it up front or doing it afterwards, it sometimes is both. Right? Especially as you move from scale.
Right. Yes.
That you and I can negotiate. I can understand that my interface is this way, so yours can be that way. But then when we go to broad adaptation, there's still part of that implementation gap.
Absolutely. The question, it's not that all of it eliminates all of the implementation barriers.
It minimizes.
Right? It just, I would say, maybe the best we can hope for is that it gets us to a point where once we get to the implementation, we don't have insurmountable barriers.
Yeah, agreed.
There's
agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed with that. Great.
All right, great. So on that note of trying to avoid insurmountable barriers, we will leave it there. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Hope to see you at the next one of these webinars. And thank you very much, Pedja, for your time. It was a great talk. See you everyone next time. Thanks.
Thanks so much for your attention. Thanks all.
Thank you, Pedja. That was excellent. Appreciate it.